Hello, and welcome to our program, Astronomy for Everyone. The topic for this month's show is the Soviet space program. And here in studio to tell us all about it is Diane Hall from the Warren Astronomical Society.
Hello, Don.
Diane, welcome back to the show. I know it's
Thank
been
you.
a while, but
yeah, quite a few years.
we're glad to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be back.
Now, how did you become interested in the Soviet space program?
So really I got into it in order to debunk some conspiracy theories. So there's a lot of misinformation swirling around the Soviet space program, like the idea that they killed a lot of cosmonauts and then covered it up. And so I got into that to research and say, okay, this is weird and this doesn't make sense. And as I dug into it, I learned not only that, yeah, a lot of these rumors came from two guys out of Italy who seemed to like a lot of media attention, but also I developed a respect for this early Soviet space program that really, as an American growing up in the 1980s during the Cold War, where you hear the Soviet space program is held together with chewing gum and spit, and their space shuttle was a ripoff of ours and things like that. Mir, the space station, caught fire. I didn't have that respect before, and I developed that respect, and I really wanted to delve into why they had incredible successes early on and very grave failures ultimately.
Now, they gave up the race in 1968, which was the year before the U.S. actually put somebody on the moon. Why did they give up early?
I would say that the end of 1968, when Apollo 8 went around the moon and humans saw the far side of the moon for the first time, that was a body blow to the Soviet space program, because to them, it wasn't purely beating us to a footprint on the moon. It was also beating us to lunar orbit. So when we put somebody in lunar orbit, they knew they had lost something.
If we could do that, then they knew how far it was to the next goal, and they must have known that they weren't close enough.
Right. To us, it was a great achievement, but it was a stepping stone. To them, it was a body blow.
Ah, yeah. So that was the signal to them. Now, the Soviets, though, had a lot of, as you said, a lot of early success. They had the first man and woman in space, a dog.
Right. So they had the first satellite, which shocked the U.S., the first animal in space with Laika, the first man in space with Yuri Gagarin, the first woman in space with Valentina Tereshkova, and the first spacewalk, which we had been planning, and they beat us to it. They beat us to the first multi-person crew in space. So it looked, up until 1964, like they were going gangbusters. They were conquering space. They were hitting every mark that we wanted to hit months ahead of us, if not years.
So they were, at that point then, favored to win the space race.
So it appeared.
Yeah.
But
wow.
The reality was a lot more complicated than what we were seeing on the surface and in the media.
Then what were some of the obstacles?
Well, so we had a system of project management here in the U.S. that was very different to their system of project management. So we had a straightforward stepping stone approach. Project Mercury had goals. Project Gemini built on those goals. Project Apollo continued those goals to get somebody on the moon. After their initial successes with Vostok, getting people in space, and Voskhod, getting multiple people in space and doing a spacewalk, their goals really sort of fell apart. It wasn't the same idea as Gemini had as its goals. You have to rendezvous multiple spacecraft. You have to do these maneuvers. You have to learn how to work in space. They got the first spacewalk in, but it was one spacewalk. We did many spacewalks. Our astronauts learned to use tools in space, to endure in space for not just minutes, but hours. The Soviets never really gave their cosmonauts that chance.
Was that because of how they designed their program?
Yeah, so they had a lot of political interference. For one thing, 1964 was a watershed year for the Soviet Union because Khrushchev stopped being the premier. Khrushchev was intimately involved in the space program. Well, he's gone. Now they've got another guy. Now everybody had to build these relationships. But critically, they had these multiple bureaus run by chief designers with a huge amount of autonomy. And these people had been interested in rockets from their youth. They'd been interested in rockets and building rockets in the pre-World War II era. After World War II, when the Soviets had access to Nazi rocketeers, same way the US had access to ex-Nazi rocketeers, they built better and better rockets, but they had a lot of personality clashes, and each individual designer had a lot on his plate. And so ultimately the Soviet model had these bureaus competing with one another, if not outright kneecapping one another, to try to get government backing to do their projects. And you really didn't have that in NASA, where it was a very top-down approach, a very unified approach.
You would have thought the Soviets would have been that way with their penchants for central planning and monolithic structure. At least that's the way it appeared to us anyway.
It's very counterintuitive that the
Yeah.
Americans had this top-down, uniform, very orderly way of going about getting to the moon, even though we were outsourcing things to private contractors like Grumman and North American Rockwell. And the Soviets, with it being an integrated military government program, had competition that was hurting them. It's strange. It's hard to get your head around as an American learning about it. It's like, wait a minute. The Soviets had more competition than we did, and it wasn't good.
Yeah, it would seem that if you're running multiple tracks for the same goal, you're taking away from all of them, where together they could have added to the weakness in one, and they would have moved forward much sooner with the synergy that the U.S. program had.
Definitely. Like with the U.S. program, we had, say the Saturn V was the same rocket that not only got Apollo 8 around the moon, it got subsequent lunar missions to the moon. With the Soviet bureaus, they had two different rockets competing, one to get people around the moon, one to get people to the moon. Why would you do that?
Exactly.
But that was the way that their system worked.
Was it because of this almost personality cult of these head designers?
That was a lot to do with it. So Sergei Korolev was, I would say, the leading luminary of the Soviet program. He was behind the Sputnik missions. He was behind the Vostok missions that got Yuri Gagarin and other early cosmonauts into space, the Voskhod missions, the early Soyuz missions. So he had a lot on his plate, and he was the chief designer responsible for building the rocket that should have delivered cosmonauts to the lunar surface. But he had competition in the form of other designers named Glushko and Chelomai, and they were building the rocket that would take people around the moon.
You would think you would want to design one rocket for both.
Right, which is what the U.S. did successfully.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got these three parallel programs running. Again, you've got the personalities of the three individuals, which I'm sure were very big.
Yeah, Glushko and Korolev had a lot of bad blood between them because Glushko had actually denounced Korolev to the Soviet authorities back before World War II.
Oh.
So everybody went to the Gulag, but there was a lot of bad blood there when they got out.
Okay, wow. Now, the U.S. had problems with the Apollo command module and the lunar module.
Yes.
Did the Soviets have those same issues?
Yes. So, of course, the Americans we had the problem with the Block 1 command service module for Apollo that resulted in a fire that killed people.
Yes.
And we had long-standing delays with the lunar module that resulted in the lunar module missions being pushed back significantly. Now, the Soviets, they had real lunar module designs that compared favorably, I would say, to the Grumman lunar module that the U.S. used. But as far as having a real prototype, as far as testing in space, I couldn't find any evidence that that had been delivered upon, that had been tested. Their cosmonauts trained using helicopters, so they weren't ready.
Okay.
They weren't, the hardware wasn't ready. Say we're closing in on the second half of the 60s. Kennedy set that deadline for the U.S. to meet by the end of the decade.
Right.
And at that point, the Soviets are starting to fall behind, and they know it.
Okay, but they're still battling on at this point.
Absolutely. They're fully waging the war.
Now, with their early success, again, they were favored to win, and if they had been first, who would have been the first cosmonaut on the moon?
I'm really glad you asked that, Don, because their leading candidate for that actually died quite recently, in October of this year.
Oh, no kidding.
Alexei Leonov. And so Yuri Gagarin was their first man in space. He was their hero. Now he encountered some problems after his first flight in space.
Oh.
Bit of drinking, bit of cheating on the wife, some scandals. One of which actually disfigured his face when he fell off a balcony. But he was still their hero. Well, Alexei Leonov was their first spacewalker. And Leonov was a bit more disciplined, a bit less pressure on him as the first man in space. And so it seems from what we were able to reconstruct on Soviet records, he was their leading candidate to be the first Soviet to put a boot print on the moon.
But it didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Not just one thing, many things.
Some of the issues that we've talked about already.
Yes.
The Soviets had these big personalities, as we've just discussed, and it seems like the biggest one was Korolev.
Yes, Sergei Korolev, yep.
He, left the mission. What happened with Mr. Korolev?
So he died untimely. And that may seem sinister because this is Soviet Union. You may be thinking, oh no, what happened to this man?
Knock on the door in the middle of the night.
Right, no. So he had what was seemed to be routine surgery for some intestinal problems. Turned out he had cancer. It was a much more involved surgery than he thought he was going in for. His heart, his stamina had been weakened by his spell in the Gulag. Again, this man spent years in the Gulag during the war. He died. This was January of 1966. So their guiding light, their chief designer, was dead. And it's 1966.
Okay, so...
clock's ticking.
Yeah, and the folks in his program have lost their leader.
Yes.
Who went to bat for them against the other two and the Soviet bureaucracy.
Yeah, and he had a great rapport with his cosmonauts. He really cared about all his cosmonauts as people. And the cosmonauts really, so the engineers lost their guiding light. The cosmonauts lost their advocate. His whole bureau lost their figurehead. It was bad. And there's really nothing equivalent in the American space program that you can point to and say, wow, that was the nail holding in the horseshoe, and without the horseshoe, the war is lost.
Our biggest thing, I think, and it was temporary, but still, was the fire aboard Apollo 1.
Right.
And that set us back a while.
That set us back a while, but they had equivalents to that, which we'll talk a bit about.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation about the Soviet space program. If you have a question about this topic or any other for that matter, send us an email, please. We'd love to hear from you. You can see the email address down at the bottom of your screen. And coming up next is Term of the Month. Stephen?
Thanks, Don. The term of the month is Space Race. Now, when the Russians launched Sputnik, the Americans really were in a panic, and they tried to catch up. The Russian rockets, which were ICBMs, designed to launch Russian nuclear bombs, which were bigger than the U.S. nuclear bombs, so the U.S. rockets were not as big as the Russian rockets. So anyway, the Russians, with these rockets, they proceeded to set records, just a series of firsts. So the first satellite, which was Sputnik, which we just showed, the first dog, Laika, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, and the first woman, and they had the first satellite which took pictures of the far side of the moon. So the Russians were proud of these accomplishments, and deservedly so. These were great accomplishments. And especially among these accomplishments, Yuri Gagarin's orbit. They felt they won the space race. Hands down, they won it. Well, the Americans considered their response. Should they launch a space station? That was logically next, and there were people who talked about it. But the Russians would beat them because they had bigger rockets already. So they needed a longer-term mission, a new target, higher goalposts. land someone on the moon and bring them back. This is an audacious goal. JFK, our president, said, "We go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard." Anyway, he felt that this could be achieved, that the U.S. could achieve it first, and JFK thought it could be done in the 60s. And America made it happen in July of 1969. The term of the month for December is Space Race. Back to you, Don.
Thanks, Stephen. We're back here in the studio talking with Diane Hall from the Warren Astronomical Society about the Soviet space program. So, Diane, how long did it take for them to recover from Korolev's death?
They didn't.
Oh.
So he dies in January of 1966. He has a replacement, Vasily Mishin, who is not particularly well known here in the States, who really didn't, he was a decent engineer, but he didn't really command the same respect with the cosmonauts that Korolev had. But then they suffer another terrible loss in 1967. So you mentioned that the American program lost, we lost 3 astronauts in Apollo 1 in 67. They lost one of their fine astronauts, Vladimir Komarov, in the first Soyuz mission in 1967 when the parachute didn't open on his return to Earth and he impacts the ground at full speed, and it was terrible. And then they had an even worse blow in 1968 when Yuri Gagarin was trying to return from being a hero on the PR market to being a cosmonaut in training. So he was doing flying exercises in one of their fighter jets, and it crashes. And so they've lost their great hero. And Yuri was he had his issues, you know, as I said, bit of drinking, carousing and all that, wasn't perfect, but he had a charisma and he had an affability that really glued the cosmonaut corps together. And one thing to understand about the cosmonauts is they tended to be a lot younger than their American counterparts, less seasoned, less educated than their American counterparts, and they had a lot of morale issues. And Gagarin was a leader, and when he was gone, they really didn't have a natural leader. So
a father figure.
Or just an older brother figure, even, to kind of bind them together. And of course, they had a co-ed cosmonaut program too, which after the first launch of a woman in space, the remaining women were like, "We're perfectly qualified, we can fly. Why are you not assigning us to more missions?" Well, it wasn't politically expedient, it didn't fit, whatever the reason. So losing Gagarin was horrifying to them. And whereas the Americans were able to recover from Apollo 1, it was hard, but we launched men again with Apollo 7 and then 8, 9, 10, 11. The Soviets didn't really, losing Korolev and Komarov and Gagarin, boom, boom, boom. I would say that they didn't really get over it.
So it sounds like going into 1968, they were in a deep hole, and we're still not on the moon yet.
Right, but we get people around the moon in December of 1968. So as 1968 dawned, it was iffy. But we launched Apollo 7, got people back in space, and then immediately went for a moonshot with Apollo 8, got people around the moon, see the far side, orbit the moon, come safely home. And that hit the Soviets so hard because that was half of their lunar program evaporating. But they had the N-1 rocket that Korolev had been working on up until his death, that his successors had kept on. And this was the one that had the jet engine designer working on the rockets instead of the rocket engine designer. So they've got 4 rockets.
Yep.
They go to launch in early 1969. Doesn't work, it explodes. But then Americans put people almost to the moon, 40 miles away from the moon with Apollo 10. If something had gone wrong with Apollo 10, the Soviets, they wouldn't have been happy because they'd lost people, we lost Nobody likes deaths.
Right.
But they would at least have said, oh my God, we've got some time. But Apollo 10 went off without a hitch. So we're closing out in July of 1969. The Soviets know they are on the brink of losing it all. So they apparently assign a crew to the rocket. They put the N-1, this massive rocket, not as big as the Saturn V, but very big, out on the launch pad. They're going to try. Well, thankfully, they didn't put people on it.
What happened?
It explodes.
Oh, no.
Catastrophically, destroying a large part of the launch complex. And of course, the Americans are spying on them. We register this incredible explosion. We know that they've got big rockets because the big rockets blew up. We've got this seismic activity. That's how we know how many rockets they put up to start with. But so everybody stands down, records are censored, diaries are censored. And that's pretty much it. There's a bit more activity, but we put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. It's over. The race is over.
But then the Russians, or the Soviets, pretend that they weren't even trying.
Right. So
what's up with that?
They put up 2 more rockets. So they tried to launch the remaining 2 completed N1s. They both explode. The remaining ones are turned into playground equipment. You can go to Baikonur today and see these rocket bits as repurposed band shells, playground equipment, signs. But they put about, officially, all they ever intended to do was low Earth orbit with Soyuz, with Salyut, the first real functional space station. And that becomes the story until Glasnost, when the records start coming out. And that culture of secrecy fed the conspiracy theories that got me into it in the first place. Because, yeah, they lied. They lied about a lot of things. They didn't lie about murdering a bunch of people and covering up, but they definitely lied about their goals at any given time, the success that they made, whether or not they intended to go to the moon, whether or not they had crews assigned to the moon. But the truth came out, and now we know the full grandeur of their failure.
So it sounds like they had some great success, but along with that came great failure.
Right. And really what came out of it was that other part of the program that would have gotten people around the moon, that turned into the proton rocket, which they didn't perfect until the 1970s, but it's one of the most successful rockets ever built. So they had long-term successes, even if, yeah, they lost the moon race, but we're still using that technology 40 years later. So it's not really a loss.
Interesting, very interesting. I want to thank our guest for being with us here today to fill us in on some interesting information about the Soviet space program. We'd like you to visit our club website. We have the address down at the bottom of your screen. And coming up next, Stephen will have What's Up in the Night Sky.
Thanks, Don. What's up in the night sky for December 2019? Now, we're approaching the winter solstice, December 21st, so the day length is rather similar over the month. So sunrise is from 7:42 a.m. to 8:02 a.m., and sunset is at 5:02 p.m. to 5:10 p.m. over the month. Astronomical night is about an hour and 40 minutes, plus or minus, the sunrise and sunset. The moons start with the first quarter on the 4th, the full moon on the 12th, the third quarter on the 18th, and then the new moon on the 26th. Mercury goes from Libra to Sagittarius over the month. It rises at 6 a.m. to 7:18 over the month. It's better at the beginning of the month. Again, it's a little farther from the sun, superior conjunction, that is when Mercury is on the other side of the Sun from us, is on January 10th. It's, it comes up a little bit later. Mars is in Libra and rises from 5:06 a.m. to 4:51, and is a little bit better at the end of the month because it'll be farther from the Sun again. Then we move on to Venus, which is in Sagittarius to Capricornus, sets at 6:43 to 7:51 over the course of the month. And then we have Neptune, which is in Aquarius, where it always is, and sets at 4:42 to 2:41 a.m. And then finally Uranus is in Aries, and it sets, I had the times wrong. So Uranus is 4:42 to 2:41. Neptune is 38 minutes after midnight to 10:38 p.m. in Aquarius there. Jupiter is in Sagittarius and sets at 6:17 to 4:49. It has a superior conjunction where on the 27th of the month. So Jupiter will not be visible really much at all. It's really in the glare of the Sun all month. Saturn is sets at 7:41 to 5:59. It has a superior conjunction coming up January 13th, so it's going to be hard to see this month. And Pluto is probably impossible, has very similar times to Saturn. We do have one of our major meteor showers, December 22nd through January 17th, but it starts in December. The maximum meteor rate should be on January 4th at 5 a.m. Universal Time, which is about midnight Eastern Time, 1 a.m. Eastern Time. This meteor shower has had 120 meteors per hour. That's 2 per minute. Now this is, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, this is winter, so dress warm. Look up at the entire sky. Meteors can appear anywhere. It should be great if you can get out and away from the city. And that is what's up in the night sky for December 2019. Remember, we don't charge for this show, but we may tax your brain.